Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, actually. Welcome to this afternoon's Berlage sessions, which is entitled The Architect's Mannerism or Mannerisms, given by Jacob and Samuel Stewart-Halevy, or what I have liked to jokingly call the brothers Stewart-Halevy. I don't know how often the two of you have lectured together, if ever. But well, it's a pleasure that you accepted this invitation to conclude our series, which we entitled The Architect's Manners, where we've explored the contractual distinction between builder and architect, the graphic conventions of working drawings, architects and their relationship to social media, the stylization of imagery, the masculinity embodied in practice, and well, today, other ways quote unquote mannerism is enacted by architects today. Jacob and Samuel will address the routine practices of selecting, copying, and arranging what once constituted the foundations of mannerism, but they will turn away from this historical understanding or convention of mannerism toward the tools and behaviors of the contemporary architecture workplace. They will conceptualize how mood boards reveal key routines, conventions within not only architectural practice, but also beyond. Sam is an architect and current doctoral candidate in history and theory at Columbia University. He has previously taught as a visiting artist in architecture, interior architecture and design in the interior architecture and design objects department at the School of Arts Institute of Chicago. And he was the 2013-15 Wortham Teaching Fellow at the Rice University School of Architecture. His current research follows the artifacts of participatory design, including mood boards in the post-war period, as they make their way through historically and geographically interlinked settings. Jacob works on the nexus of modern and contemporary art, intellectual history, and social theory. Subspecialties include the histories of conceptual art, design, and video, the sociology and anthropology of art, the political economy of art, and historiography. He is the author of Slant Steps, which was released last year by the University of California Press, and the essay Cipher Paradoxes of Conduct in the Reception of Mannerism, 1954 to 1973. I guess I would like to maybe interject there that this is, well, for me at least, one of the only works that has revisited the idea of mannerism in the last half century. So in a very interesting way, that kind of historiography. Jacob serves as an assistant professor of the history of art and architecture at Tufts University, and he's been a visiting research fellow in anthropology at the University of Texas at Austin since 2019. Thank you for waking up early with us, Sam, on American East Coast time, 6:45 now to give this lecture, and Jacob 1 hour later in Austin. At any rate, thank you for being here, at least live with us on the screen, even though it's unfortunate not to be able to have hosted you here in person, but we will, I'm sure, find other moments to do that in the future, as always. So the screen is yours.
Great. Thank you so much, Solomon, for that introduction, and also for the chance to be with you, even in a virtual form.
Thank you.
So I think the project that Jacob and I are going to present today continues an exchange that we've had around production culture in architecture and aligns with the other contributions to the series, which have all taken up very specific artifacts within architectural practice, like the contract, the working drawing, social media. Our talk is instead about mood boards, which we take to be a form of contemporary mannerism. So following art and architectural historians, we might loosely define mannerism as an attentiveness or awareness of style. By this, I mean a way of working that's premised heavily on borrowing and extending the work of predecessors and contemporaries, hence mannerism's connection to derivation and the copy. It draws on artifacts rather than nature. As the Dutch art historian Hessel Miedema has written, 16th century mannerism meant above all a method of working. As he put it, the often maligned movement owed its special nature to the fact that artists work so much di maniera, i.e. the working method based on routine, which had a marked influence on the external characteristics of the work of art. So for Miedema and many others, this increasing routinization of work corresponded to the increasing stylization of the resulting paintings, sculptures, and architecture. But we are not presentists, and therefore we're not so invested in this talk about drawing connections to the historical mannerism of the 16th century, which would be a bit of a red herring. So I hope there's no false advertising there. Instead, we're more concerned with mood boarding in architectural and design practice today. And so to that end, we're going to turn not to the Laurentian Library, but instead to the interior of a Brooklyn brownstone as it takes shape within the mood board of a contemporary architectural office in Manhattan. This is a mood board, but what is it exactly? We might provisionally define mood boards as, at the outset, as an array of images meant to invoke or recall the connections among them through associations. Like working drawings, mood boards have an internal role within firms as teammates use them to get it on the same page and align their ideas. However, they're not governed by any precise set of conventions or standards. Like contracts, mood boards mediate the relationship between architects, their clients, and other sub-consultants like rendering firms, but not as a way of marking off or delimiting responsibilities, but instead as a way of pitching ideas and eliciting feedback. While not a form of social media, mood boards source from the same streams of images that circulate on platforms like Instagram and Pinterest. And they constitute a network of citation in and of themselves. So when we were preparing for this talk and interviewing different designers about mood boards, we would sometimes hear that projects that they had used or their own projects had shown up on the mood boards of other designers whom they themselves had used on their own mood boards, suggesting a kind of feedback loop or infinite regression of style. Today, mood boards are used not only by architects, but across many creative industries, from art direction to production design, fashion, advertising. To give a very brief typology, we could distinguish between boards that are produced by designers, individuals, and qualitative researchers. So, for instance, here are two pitches for an app designed by a service design firm. One is supposed to be clean, simple, minimal, modern, and bold. The other one is clean, elegant, classy, simple, and current. You can't, there's a lot of repetition in those words, but the combination of words and images and references give each of these pitches a different look, a different vibe, as you'll see later on. Mood boards are not only made by designers, they also play a role in the lives of everyday individuals. So for instance, this is a vision board created by someone named Aaron H., who is enrolled in a service provided by a company called Vault 365, which is owned by the motivational speaker and comedian Steve Harvey. So like the mood boards of designers that anticipate the realization of a project, these aspirational mood boards also have a projective function. For Steve Harvey, who's drawing on scripture in this Facebook comment, the vision board is not just a representation of the future, but an artifact imbued with a sacred power that can make these visions come to life. So they're a kind of visual incantation within a system of enchantment and belief. If everyday mood boarders use them to divine the future and to announce their own subjectivities, it's not surprising then that they are valuable as well within market research. And here they're part of a set of what's called projective techniques that are used in order to measure intensity of feeling by consumers. So this is an example of a qualitative study published in the Journal of Consumer Research, in which divided its research subjects by nationality and gender. On the left, there are the desires of a group of American men, and on the right, Danish women. So
Sam and I first began to think about mood boards in these different contexts around the beginning of the pandemic, as we wondered what their relationship might be to the history of art and design and architecture, and what epistemologies the artifact might belong to. I came at this project from an art history and media theory background with a basic question: how are meanings produced through the arrangement and juxtaposition of images? A classic question. And this is an issue that we find in the modernist tradition of collage, but also in empathy theory and the idea that images produce feelings and intuitions in us. And it also seems to draw from symbolism, where there's this idea of correspondences or associations between the images invoked in, say, a poem or an illustration that can produce synesthesia. And of course, through art history itself and its discussion of iconology, where there's a collision or rift among images and motifs that might be the key to historical forces. So the Vienna School art historian Abby Warburg famously made what are known as image atlases. These are images consisting of various motifs pasted on black cloth fields. And each panel of the atlas serves as a kind of map of art history, what Warburg thought of as a sequence of intervals, where the images contain or serve as a way station for energies that traverse time. And eventually, scholars looking at Warburg came to think about the image atlas as a form of proto-filmic montage. So these are just some of the early historical associations we might make with the practice of mood boarding.
In terms of the history of design, in my excuse me, in my dissertation research on participatory design, I had come across some earlier examples of the use of mood boards in order to elicit feedback from lay people and also to cross over divides of expertise. So here you can see an image of an association game being played by bank tellers in Buskerud, Norway in the mid-1980s. Instead of being given questionnaires and surveys, these bank tellers are being asked to explore their preconceptions and emotions in response to a series of collages that are posted on the wall. So then later on, these statements are going to be presented back to them by the designers of this game and used to come up with a plan for introducing computers into their workplace. So in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, mood boards were part of an array of artifacts, including solicited sketches, mock-ups, immersive simulations, and forms of televisual feedback that designers adopted as they began to reorient themselves towards their users and audiences in new and more intimate ways. Today, we would argue that the uptake of mood boards corresponds to a different shift in the division of architectural labor. As the scope of what architects do diminishes and the visibility of architecture increases, firms and their leads become increasingly preoccupied with the look of their projects while delegating the technical decisions to middle management and outsourcing the logistics to third parties. In this increasingly competitive context, mood boards, as we will see, become sites of high stakes negotiation and distinction. Even if they appear to be casually put together, they are assembled with a great attentiveness to style. This is where architects imitate one another in order to differentiate themselves. They are guided not just by personal feelings or charismatic intuitions, but by one another and by what the mood board allows them to see. In what follows, we will try to demystify this practice through our own field work that we've undertaken inside a Manhattan architecture firm. So this part is called The Sorcerers. Here it's 4 p.m. on Friday, and Max and Bill are mood boarding a residential renovation for a world-famous artist. Max has spent the last few minutes Google image searching for Art Nouveau cat stands, while Bill has been browsing the websites and Instagram feeds of textile and furniture designers. Every few minutes, Max and Bill pull images from their respective searches and drop them into a shared file on the visual collaboration platform Miro, where they become visible to one another. Digital mood boarders are, for the most part, sedentary workers, but on the shared interface of Miro, Max and Bill's eponymously named cursors are hyperactive, dropping, cropping, moving, and rescaling images across pages that loosely correspond to spaces and objects within the house that they're designing. Not finding any Art Nouveau cat stands, Max gets up from his desk to pull a Victor Horta monograph from the office shelf. The fireplace of the Hotel Van Eetveld catches Max's eye as he flips back and forth through the full bleed spreads, prompting an invitation to Bill to look as well. And here we'll do a short reenactment of this. So this mantle is so crazy.
That's awesome.
I have no idea what's happening up here.
It's like warped or something.
I think it's just a beveled surface. This situation over here is kind of wild.
Yeah.
But I feel like it's a little bit the vibe, even though these are not the details. So we want to ask, what's happening in this exchange? Have Max and Bill made a creative breakthrough, a kind of miracle? Or have they been unwittingly cast under what Hermann Muthesius once derided as the indiscriminate spell of the whiplash line? Are they engaged in a decontextualized form of citation that might solicit a knowing wink from connoisseurs of the Art Nouveau? Or does their excitement over the wild situation of this overwrought mantle actually have an unfortunate resonance with the Congolese exploits of its owner and Horta's patron, Edmund van Eetveld? Or maybe these specific associations fall away as soon as Max and Bill are feeling the vibe and leaving the details behind. Max and Bill's sources may bear no formal resemblance to the interiors that they eventually design, and their mood board will probably never be seen by their artist client. Their comments are made in passing and their images are substitutable. in Miro, the Horta vibe will soon be evoked not by the wild and crazy mantle, but instead by this vegetal lamp, which has been attributed to Horta by an online auction site. When dropped into a page that includes a shot of pavilions, a sculpture by the artist Rashid Johnson, and a pendant light designed by Omer Arbel, Horta's tendril motifs contribute to an overall atmosphere. In facilitating these quick and efficient associations among decontextualized sources, Miro speaks to a longer history of the use of associative images in architecture, and any number of examples could stand in here, but the most well-known might be John Soane's eclectic arrangement of plaster busts and casts and paintings at Lincoln and Fields, which were organized not by chronology or geography, but instead as a heterogeneous collection of fragments. Or in the medium of the magazine, we could think about Le Corbusier's sourcing of images from manufacturers' brochures and industrial catalogs in order to invoke l'esprit nouveau. Or more recently, even Koolhaas's personal collections of photographs and their use as kind of oblique illustrations in SMLXL, which recast his architectural polemics in the language of 1990s visual branding. So these examples are perhaps overdetermined in that they already have achieved a canonical status within architectural history and build upon one another in conscious ways. And maybe others come to mind for you. Our interest is less in finding lines of descent from mood boards to these avant-garde interventions, but instead to reveal how practices of collecting, arranging, and copying work function within the everyday practice of architecture. So it's important to keep in mind that Max and Bill's mood board is not a strategy of publicity or even didactic visual aid, but instead a working document inside the life of a firm. There's no written discourse that it accompanies. Its discourse emerges through speech, gesture, and more fine-grained modalities of communication that are studied in fields outside of art and architectural history, and which Jacob will introduce.
So although architectural historians haven't contemplated mood boarding at length, in recent decades, there's been a spate of social science research on policies and practices at work. And that's commonly called workplace studies. And within that field, scholars sometimes concentrate on the so-called creative industries. I know that's a term that's sort of anathema to people actually working in those industries, like fashion, advertising, architecture, design, cinema. And these scholars try to locate exactly how and why and when and where moments of so-called creativity occur. Which seems to be important to these highly competitive industries that are always trying to manage and optimize innovation. Recent studies include ethnographies by Keith Murphy and Lily Irani on design in Scandinavia and India, respectively. I think of Aitan Wilf's books on jazz improvisation and innovation consultants, Anand Pandian and John Caldwell's work on Hollywood and Bollywood production cultures, to name a few. And some of these studies take the more general culture industry approach. They think about how film, design, architecture, and other fields contribute to broader race, gender, and class-based ideologies, while others define their scope far more narrowly and discuss how workplace dynamics unfold over the course of specific conversations through turn-taking and gestural practices. And that second approach is part of a tradition called ethnomethodology or conversation analysis. And we'll do a bit of this later on in our own presentation. Nevertheless, all of these scholars share a common focus on the dynamics among professionals and the kind of artifacts they used to devise their ideas and products. So, like the social science scholars, we are interested in mood boards not so much for how they look, but for how they afford projection and discussion, or really what we might call projective or future-oriented discussion. That is, what do we want this thing we're making to look like, right? How do we want it to feel? What's the tone we're going for? Does it fit within this specific genre we're after, or this brand imaginary? When we might consider these exercises sort of like preliminary proposals or a way of ordering or mapping the future, and even perhaps a new form of collaborative or distributed aesthetic judgment. Mood boards often bring lots of different constituents in the workplace, whether they're in like sales and accounting or product development or engineering or marketing or retail or management, or even the consumers themselves. They bring them on the same wavelength, or as Sam put it earlier, in the same vibes or in the same mindset. And when designers meet with their colleagues and clients, they use these boards to facilitate projects through various stages of production, giving them a sense of the kind of cultural connotations of their designs and where they might fit in or where they might buck industry-wide trends. Therefore, even though mood boards are rarely displayed to a general public, they're kind of hidden in the back rooms, right, or in the, deep in the files, they play a crucial role in the realization of products. We're not the first to realize that, of course, and in fact, in the absence of historical treatments of mood boards and workplace studies on them, within design practices, designers and architects have taken it upon themselves to self-theorize what it is they're doing when they make and use them. And here studies have focused on one, context of usage in the firm and within university design courses that perhaps you yourselves are in right now. Two, the formal choices involved in selection and arrangement of images. Three, this utility of semantic ambiguity, right? Kind of making things a little messed up and not really understanding the meaning of them. How is that useful? And four, their capacity to elicit things like inspiration, empathy, and engagement from the various stakeholders. So here are Max and Bill discussing with Sam what it is that they think they're doing when they make the mood boards.
I feel like a lot of what you're seeing now is still zoomed out. It's a lot of space planning, kind of thinking about potential objects more than real mood, I guess. Maybe towards the end of that conversation, we started to discuss material palettes and feelings and stuff like that. But I think that as we progress, the resolution on that type of the material planning and what I guess we would typically consider to be a mood board on our end. I don't know what you consider to be a mood board on your end. But our mood boards are typically material palettes or spreads of kind of different materials that are all kind of either in the house or in adjacent rooms or as a way to kind of evaluate the whole picture.
They're more like record keeping.
Right.
Yeah.
So in short, the project slowly moved toward the feelings, palettes, materials of the board and the boards are meant to evaluate a kind of gestalt or the whole picture. And as Max points out, they're good for record keeping too. And those themes are reiterated in the literature. So to provide a too brief overview of that literature, in the field of design education, this may be familiar to you, teachers often make their students construct boards to improve their visual literacy skills in image research and critical analysis, so they can gain competence in presenting and discussing images in terms of their shape, form, color, texture, details, and symbolic connotations. Students are often taught to collect images and swatches and samples and other evocative material, and then arrange them according to a design brief. And that brief might just be a key set of keywords or a genre or a theme presented in the fashion or design or architecture press, or even their perceptions about themselves, depending on the course. And as they complete their assignments, as Sam discussed, they use image search engines and other online media sources. Upon finding the right image, they crop, reverse, or modify it. And some images come from the designer's own personal collections, and they supplement them with small drawings or even photographs that they've taken themselves. After completing these assignments, students establish similarities and contradictions among the images with their peers, oftentimes in group critique settings. Students' discussions seem to model the kinds of teamwork that plays out at the office when coworkers share collections of keywords, sounds, images, and textures with each other. Their boards are often highly structured by evocative phrases that emerge within the context of worker-client meetings or among mood board makers, and keywords push designers to reflect the visions of their clients and help them find shared footing. But the boards also help when moving down the division of labor to manage the technical aspects of a project. So in the literature, one designer says, it's very handy to have these mood boards to show to the technical persons. Look, this is a structure I would like to have, something like this. Therefore, we might say where the mood boards might communicate, say, an atmosphere or feeling to a client, they might communicate an exact way of working or manner to someone who needs to realize the technical dimensions of a project further down the line. Indeed, as mood boards become more prevalent, the tasks of constructing them are increasingly outsourced to experts who operate on a freelance basis. And we found that there are firms who do mood boards only at this point. In both cases, the boards prove to be soft ways of moving stakeholders through iterations of the project. They're more like a suggestion than a direction, and they can be explained or verified later, even if the reference points to color and shape and form aren't completely understood at the outset. Moreover, as Max mentions in the clip, in lieu of meeting minutes, mood boards supply a kind of material record of the decision-making processes within a company, and often serve as a visual deliverable to clients as proof that they've done something. You know, the client comes back to them and they're like, what have you been working on? They have the mood board to show at least. Even though they serve these important pragmatic functions, mood boards are supposed to remain somewhat ambiguous, as I mentioned earlier. One designer says, if it's too literal, it's of no use. And images that describe existing products are frowned upon. Another writes that the use of ambiguity makes boards evocative rather than didactic and mysterious rather than obvious. Still another writes that the board is meant to be a loose mixing of intent and outcome, a feeling your way forward. Although designers certainly don't want fuzzy or inconsistent or weak or unfocused or uninspiring boards, they do seek out synesthesia and polysemy. So Andres Lucero, who has conducted the most extensive research on mood boards to date through his dissertation about a decade ago, argues that industrial designers often use more mood boards to encapsulate qualities of atmosphere and voice. And he notes how designers often try to invoke things like smell and touch and the other senses. If a board remains ambiguous to collaborators or clients, then it seems to open up a space of conversation among them and serves as a platform for their joint attention, affording a wider range of interpretations. They may compel people to join in the work of making sense of a system and its context, thereby triggering reinterpretations. And contrasting readings centered around the mood board lead coworkers and clients into a productive discussion about what a hypothetical product might end up becoming, or what needs it might fulfill, or how it will fit into future worlds. Of course, it can lead to a less productive discussion too. I would like to highlight, right? Riffs and things like that might also develop out of the mood board. So mood boards therefore participate in what we might call the post-war embrace of uncertainty after Wilf in the workplace. They're just one of a whole repertoire of managerial templates and technologies devised since the mid-century that try to cultivate spontaneity and reveal the unexpected and the ethereal in the service of innovation. As Lucero puts it, mood boards play an important role in paradoxing, allowing the designer to research a paradox of apparently conflicting or contradicting ideas. And in that sense, mood boards are distinctly modern. They both directly and indirectly draw on strategies of the historical and neo-avant-gardes, whose practices of things like montage, collage, the exquisite corpse, automatic writing, and the derive are regularly drawn upon to shake up dynamics among white-collar workers. Of course, alongside the drive to provoke and produce these creative responses through moments that are unconstrained or uncontrolled, comes the impulse to capture and measure them so that they may be tested and standardized and graded and monetized. And designers have tried to do this through the so-called cita rasa method, where effective descriptors are mapped onto product components. Others use things like the semantic differential survey that correlates attributes and evaluations. And still more, look at how user preferences are determined by mapping board concepts onto a 7-point Likert scale. So these kind of efforts in quantifying mood. And those efforts collide against the designer's drive to elicit feelings and cognitive effects through channels that they themselves think exceed written or spoken language. One designer, for instance, considers mood boarding to be a form of pre-verbal presentation that provokes motivational stimuli. Others like how the boards call upon the other senses in ways that transcend simple reference. Some even imagine that their visual communication might go beyond language barriers and symbolic meanings altogether. And we try to push against this idea a bit in our own research, as you'll see.
So now we'd like to do return to Max and Bill and do some close readings of our mood boarders at work. Here you see Max and Bill, once again, the two designers at this Manhattan-based firm. Max is the principal of the firm, and Bill specializes in sourcing images. So we're wondering here about how their collaborative imagining of the future space becomes distributed across the inscriptions made on the software, the talk between the designers and their nonverbal gestures. Max and Bill aren't having a meeting, really. It's more like parallel play. They often use session or working session rather than meeting to describe their activity, lending it a kind of jam session or therapy session valence, a place for unearthing something through improvisation. This is important because programs like Miro promise a kind of transparency of communication and effervescence that comes from getting a lot of people together. So you can see the other person's cursor, you can video chat, you can comment, you can invite your squad to come play with you. But for Max and Bill, things aren't so smooth or felicitous, as you'll see. They have to get each other's attention in much more direct, physical ways.
Like to add here, some sort of. Does this want to be this? Does it want to be important? Yeah. Nice images from more.
So even though it seems like nothing or very little is happening here. And on Zoom, I wonder how much you even are able to hear of this. It's actually rich with information about how the lead and assistant are collaborating and feeling out the project as they go along. Architects, and especially architecture students, often think that this sort of surfing and browsing activity is a respite from work or perhaps even a waste of time. But Max and Bill seem to be doing something important as well. In this sequence, Bill makes a nonverbal suggestion to Max by tilting his monitor towards him. And then the monitor shows a grid of images from a Google search about an artist installation that Bill's just found. They're important because these images are important because they contain plants in an interior structure, which is what Max and Bill are trying to do with their commission. Max performs what's called body torque, where people have described how coworkers kind of working in parallel with one another address each other. So Max kind of torques his torso over while maintaining his sitting position as if to say, yes, I'm momentarily attending to you, Bill, but I'll be back to my work soon enough. Max, after Bill tilts the monitor, kind of upgrades Bill's suggestion with a series of yeah, that seem to indicate that he's slowly convincing Bill and himself that the art installation images might fit with his vision for the project too, ending in a I could get behind that. At that point, Bill echoes Max's yeah and turns back to his own screen, making his fingers dance in front of all of the images, kind of like this, right? As if to say, in this general vein, or in these vibes, or this mood over here, you know? And Max affirms Bill's idea and uses the gesture to specify where the image might fit into a set of historical references, implying that the vision itself has volition, elongating the E sound in be, to make the verb search for its reference, right? First, does it want to be this? And does it want to be the architect John Portman? Finding that they lack a clear reference to women architects and designers, presumably, which is also one of the design briefs. In that manner, the tilting of the monitor yields an occasion for a collaborative assessment of Bill's sourcing work, which Max seems to affirm at the level of style, but then reject at the level of historical content and theme, i.e. the lack of reference to women, which makes this suggestion by Bill a no-go. Almost everything in this clip is understood or accepted. Neither of them ever say no or downgrade the other one's assessment, even though it's not actually clear from our analytic point of view what's being said or what's been agreed to. What's Max getting behind when he says, I could get behind that? What's the meaning of Bill's hand dance? Does this want to be what exactly? What aspects of John Portman are worth emulating? They're talking kind of around the future, leaving open possibilities for decisions to be made later on down the line, for knowledge that they don't really have yet, rather than something that they both understand and doesn't need to be said. So let's move on now to sequence 2. These next sequences are all related, and unlike in the previous one, here they really seem to be vibing and arriving at a sort of consensus, at least sometimes. Max and Bill are trying to articulate the relationship between the wainscoting and the stark white wall above it, drawing from a central source photograph in Miro. Before they begin the sequence, they talk about reducing the color and texture contrast between the two elements, between this wooden part down below and the white sheetrock wall above. And the not quite white panel or screen that could take place above the wainscoting has been proposed as a topic of inquiry. So let's take it from there.
Like would we even do a kind of like a painted wood panel or something, so that it's not just
like in between
paint on sheetrock.
in between like the wainscoting and the crown,
right? Or something.
Another layer,
right?
I kind of like. I mean, maybe this is like a little mid-century. It's more kind of like canvas or
Grass cloth.
woven grass cloth covering, something like that.
Yeah, like something that feels lighter.
It's much lighter than like a taller wood paneling or something.
Yeah, something lighter but that still
Has like a surface of interest. And, yeah.
So here Max suggests installing a painted paneling instead of painting directly on the sheetrock wall, what he initially calls a layer. But then Bill raises another possibility, referring to a source image on his monitor in which a canvas colored cloth or paper covers an interior wall and adjoins a lighter wood. He calls this look mid-century, presumably referring to the entire room whose light wood paneling, beams, and sculptural ornament recall interiors from that era. Max talks about how a canvas or grass cloth covering would feel lighter than painted paneling and that runs further up the wall. At which point Bill flips to an image of this heavier, taller wood paneling in real time. And then Bill specifies that these kind of lighter cloths have a surface of interest as opposed to the blank white sheetrock, and Max agrees. Some things to note here are the use of or something and or something else to hedge or qualify potential subjective tastes, softening the taste by creating a hesitant stance towards them. So finally, I want to address the question of multimodality. That is the way in which the channels of talk and gesture and screen navigation are working in tandem and interfering with one another. Here, the use of the cursor is used primarily during the pauses to highlight where they are focusing their attention, namely the wall, circling it and going back and forth. But the cursor movement back and forth across the mid-century wall and their own project wall seems to be gesturally transposing the light canvas onto the sheetrock. It's a kind of haptic suggestion on Bill's part. So the conversation then turns to texture, that is, what makes a good surface of interest? And would this one from the mid-century room fit their vision?
You don't think that the grass cloth raffia is like too close to like the thatch stuff?
No, I don't think so. I would worry more that it has too much of a mid-century vibe. Honestly.
So Max and Bill are trying to find and source exactly the texture they're looking for. They flip through wallpapers on Philip Jeffries, this wallpaper supply site that allows them to look at details of each texture sample. Bill asks Max about a potential further distinction, namely whether grass cloth or raffia is too close to thatched wallpaper. And even as he raises this concern, Bill is already backtracking, hitting the back button away from the thatch stuff towards safer ground. Max takes up the preferred assessment in his turn, saying he agrees with Bill. Grass and thatched are not too close. But then he does something tricky. He uses Bill's expression of doubt about the decision to raise another problem. He recycles Bill's earlier positive assessment that this kind of texture was mid-century, only in order to downgrade it. Harsh. Max argues that the look is too mid-century. Shot down, Bill utters a regretful and keeps scrolling. But then Max softens his judgment by qualifying it as honestly, but, as if to say he's just saying what he thinks, that it's his subjective taste and other people might think differently. Here I just want to point out little closer how Bill navigates the screen space in tandem with his interest in the thatch cloth. When Bill says the grass cloth raffia is like too close to the thatch stuff, do you? He actually changes the screen to present alternative textures by hitting the back button. On their site, Philip Jeffries has a microscopic feature, as you saw, where you blow up the texture, which makes it seem decisive. So right when he says thatch, proffering up that as the look they should go with, he actually takes away or softens the suggestion almost as a form of self-deprecation. Remember, he's the assistant here, Max is the lead, and redirects it and qualifies it, taking it back, but not verbally, right? Through redirecting his screen search briefly. This seems to be a way of leaving the previous possibilities open while suggesting a direction for his boss, Max, to go in. Our last clip concerns one final alternative solution.
I mean, it could still be like kind of light and visually Bill.
I guess the question that I have is, is there still some merit to the idea that there's like a layer of something that is like behind, you know?
Yeah.
Somehow.
I mean, I still think that you cover the wall.
Mhm.
Like, I think that the white wall gets, I think, whether it's a grass cloth or, you know, I think even if it was just like, kind of like, maybe, what if it was like a really kind of like modeled plaster or something, even like almost like distressed or something like that, like not, you know.
I feel like it needs to be sort of like not a matte surface. But I like the idea that then these things that are sitting in front are kind of light, you know.
Yeah.
Like egg has that really almost sort of like cream colored lacquer. You know. Yeah, I think that's too.
Yeah, it's too decrepit, but somewhere.
So as the two continue to search for the right background to the wainscoting, Bill reminds Max of the decision that they've agreed upon, namely that whatever goes above the wainscoting should be light, here emphasizing the word light, as if to make it decisive. Bill circles his line drawing as an example of a light desk shelf unit, and Max revisits the earlier conversations by creating continuity, recycling Bill's use of still in line 3 and then in lines 4 and 6 by emphasizing it and drawing it out. By line 5, Bill zooms out to find Max and his cursor. Bill says, "I still think we cover the wall." And by line 8, Max takes his cursor and draws a provisional yellow line from the crown molding to the wainscoting. Then Bill reiterates still once again, reinforcing their agreement by running a physical line with his cursor on the monitor at the division between the wainscoting and the sheetrock. At this point, Max changes the color of his digital pen and physically makes a white wall a surface of interest by drawing gray zigzags on it. This spurs Bill to use the previous idea of the grass cloth, which has been rejected because of its mid-century vibes, to suggest an alternative, a more mottled surface, a surface that has more age or wear, something distressed, perhaps age plaster. There's even another hand dance. Bill quickly goes back to the mood board, reaffirming their resolve. The wall will not be blank white. It will not just remain a matte surface. he starts to look at their previous projects, and then a peer designer, Pierre Jovanovich. How does Jovanovich treat interior walls? While Bill sifts through source images, Max begins to describe a potential surface texture and color that would avoid being matte or white, a cream-colored lacquer finish. Max's vision contrasts sharply with the ruined, pockmarked wall that Bill finds through Googling Pierre Jovanovich, which Max quickly dismisses as too, and Bill latches on to that assessment, specifying too as too decrepit.
All right. So thanks for bearing with us with these very close readings of these clips. Here are some things we can say definitively after looking at this footage. These guys like to keep it soft, always hedging and qualifying suggestions and evaluations. So perhaps this might tie into broader themes around manner in the series. There's a lot of continuation as well, where Max and Bill pause and make room for each other to intervene. And there's interesting things happening, as Sam pointed out, at the level of multimodality, namely the interconnections across the cursor, drawing, speech, and gesture. The relative dynamism of the board is a kind of living artifact, a flatbed picture plane, as we art historians might say, prolongs the conversation between the two, acting as a buffer against hasty conclusions and always holding out the possibility that any decision in the here and now will be subject to revision later. That's important to workplace dynamics because they position proposals always in a provisional or subjunctive space. They're suggestive of solutions without imposing them. But the footage also shows how artifacts work in tandem with their users. The designers and architects elongate their words and include multiple long pauses in between them, thereby creating increased openings and opportunities for the interlocutor to join in the evaluation. This might just be a feature of multitasking, where they're doing many things at once with the cursor and turning to each other while directing their attention to further potential source images. But the situation also creates not just overlapping or juxtaposed imagery, but also overlapping talk in moments where the two latch onto one another's sentences, finishing them or keeping them open or redirecting them to new topics. It also leads to quite a bit of speech recycling, as we've discussed, where given words are hung onto like a scaffold to frame future topics. Mid-century, for instance, gets referred to at various points, or the to qualifier, right? It's a to this or to that, which lets the interlocutor bring a new referent to it, or the elongated be, right, that buzzes around, landing at potential indices. Does it want to be this or be John Portman? Or layer, right, which serves as a future for more specific textures, kind of placeholder. Hand dancing also seems to do this. Bill's way of saying, you know, no big deal, or a gestural equivalent to saying or something. Here's my suggestion, but you don't have to run with it if you don't want to. In terms of continuation, speech that's commonly meant to produce the closure of a turn actually serves to open a new one. So when they're always saying like or something else after and before they make a claim, that's important because you can say, what about this or something? And then right after you can say, or something with this look to it. And finally, our research confirms what other scholars have discussed in innovation and product evolution research, where workers attribute a kind of voice or personality to an emerging product or project or brand, leaving it a space to grow, metaphorically speaking. So questioning where the it wants to go in Max's repetition of does it want to be, for instance. So drawing on the fields of conversation analysis and ethnomethodology, these are just some of the ways that we're beginning to characterize what aesthetic judgment and evaluation looks like in real time, as mediated by the board and distributed across the different coworkers.
So finally, in the time that we have left, we just want to zoom out a little bit from this study of micro interaction to the broader geography and history of mood boards, which is the subject of a book that we've been co-editing together. Our book is composed of scholarly essays in the fields of art history and historiography, production studies of the creative industries, ethnographies of mood boards in professional life, along with oral histories and interviews by those who make them as part of their job. So just to survey a few of these interventions and stop us if we're going on too long, one contributor is an anthropologist who's going to be looking at sequencing images. So he's exploring in particular the idea of a biology of images posited by the British polymath Augustus Pitt Rivers and the Swedish archaeologist Hjalmar Stolpe to think about how putting images together aids memory. So what happens to perception and memory in the move from looking at a single image to a sequence of images, or what Warburg called a space of thought, or Denkraum.
The book then turns to collage and exhibition planning and sampling. One scholar is looking at boards before the 1980s, before they were called mood boards properly. And she's exploring the techniques of designers that they use to present and sell their ideas. Looking at a collection of 1920s design books held at the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich, and proto mood boards in the 1950s, and the way they became assimilated by the neo-avant-gardes, for instance, in the work of Allison and Peter Smithson, or the independent group, who some of you might be familiar with, and that kind of how that kind of fed into new uses of collage and image research.
These discussions then lead to a series of production studies dealing with the creative industries, such as film. So another interesting contribution in our volume is by a visual, it's about visual research in the film industry. So Hollywood needs lookbooks and mood boards to persuade financiers, executives, and stars of the aesthetic of a film in the works. So these draw heavily on the looks and sets of other films, meaning that what is imagined is always already in the archive.
Another contributor is looking at the history of mood boards and branding and market research as a form of projection. And he's thinking a lot about the post-war moment when psychologists and cultural anthropologists and market researchers were all focused on personality. And here we might think about tests like Rorschach tests or the thematic apperception test, which you see here, and other methods for eliciting deep, but perhaps barely noticeable or registerable dispositions or moods or feelings through images, and how those methods have changed over time, morphing into things like emotional branding.
And of course, the book would not be complete without hearing from the makers of mood boards themselves. So here we're going to be canvassing designers who've achieved a kind of guru status in their respective fields for the ways that they use mood boards to present design thinking or their intuitions about references. We could think of this image of Diana Vreeland, the famous Vogue editor, in her office from 1965, where we won't be interviewing her. She's no longer alive. But we will also present oral histories and interviews with their assistants, those working below the line, hustling for these more prominent figures, and who are often tasked with interpreting and realizing someone else's vision. And then finally, we're going to survey ordinary people who make the boards for therapeutic, archival, commercial, or venerative purposes. Think back to the Steve Harvey boards, or members of the Gen Z so-called polyvore community on Instagram, where they become a signal form of online communication among strangers in recent years. So these are there are many more avenues that could be discussed here. This is just a brief overview of where things are headed research and publication wise. So we're also curious about how they play a role in your own education or in your work. If you notice them in your internships or professional environments. So it'd be great to hear from you, and thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jacob and Sam, for a very interesting lecture. We look forward to the book coming out. In the meantime, I believe maybe we can stop sharing so you can see all of us, even though there's a couple screens here. There are some questions, I believe. Mariano, you had one to kick off.
Yeah, sure. Well, actually, thank you very much for your lecture. I mean, this is more like a curiosity, but especially in the dialogue of these two guys, and in general, it seems always that they refer to a sort of common understanding. It seems that they always refer to the fact that there's a sort of a background knowledge that we refer to. But what happens if the client doesn't have this kind of common understanding? What happened? I mean, and how do you think this kind of common understanding, which for me seems to be the very fundamental part of the mood board, because without the fact that we assume these aesthetics to link to these sort of feelings, okay, we cannot really bridge, we cannot really establish any discourse. So how do you analyze the fact that we all supposed to have this sort of common understanding, and is it maybe linked to CM? I don't know, sort of modern. I mean, where do you think it comes from? Thank you.
I can just say, you know, from doing the literature review for this talk or this project, there's a lot in it about the kind of visual literacy as conceived by designers, and what, you know, they are conceiving of themselves as having a kind of expertise in analyzing images and thinking about their interconnections or the intervals among them. And they often worry, as you're saying, about how much a client is going to be able to understand that. And so a lot of the mood board work is about translation, right? The mood boarders need to translate the visions of the client, which are predominantly spoken, right, or conveyed orally in meetings or via email, right, into visual form. And then they need to reconvey that back to a client to show them as a deliverable that they've been doing some kind of work. And that's, you know, I think that's really, it both talks about how people do kind of become kind of literate with visual materials, but it also speaks to the fact that designers need both, right? They need these multiple channels of communication. When they're making mood boards, those are always objects, visual objects perhaps, that are meant to be spoken about, right? Meant to be captioned, meant to be discussed, right? So it's not just like they're learning one skill through the eyes or something, right? That's always a skill that has multiple ways of thinking and working and articulating at the same time, which is something I would guess you as students are learning now as well, right? Which I discuss in the assignment, the question, right? Where you're learning to present an assignment, but also how to discuss it, say, in group critique settings, which go on to kind of form the manners and mannerisms of the workplace once you get out of the Berlage. But I'll let Sam answer the CM question because he's the architectural historian here.
Yeah, you know, actually in preparing for this talk, I was thinking whether we, thinking about the CM grill as a potential mood board, or you know, part of the genealogy of mood boarding and architecture. The distinction though that I would draw between that and what we're looking at in the Miro page of Max and Bill is that the grill is grilled, right? It's images which are being placed within a matrix, and then even if that matrix is transgressed or disrupted through like the Smithson's version of the grill, it's still a common format that is understood by all who are going to be looking at it. So I think one thing that's we found in this is that even though mood boards seem to provide this kind of endless flexibility, endless space to keep assembling and combining images, there is constantly a need to frame or organize these images, or else they get out of hand. There's a kind of entropy. Even in Miro, you'll see, I guess we didn't show this, but if you zoom all the way out, this mood board that Max and Bill have been working on, they've been working on with other colleagues over the course of weeks. And because there's no limit to the amount of space you can source images in Miro, it really starts to get unwieldy, out of hand. So I wonder whether, I'd say that it's not as if the Siam grill is not a mood board, but it speaks to this constant dynamic and mood boarding between free play and sourcing, and then the desire to format and frame and organize that we've found not just in architecture, but in other contexts.
Thank you.
Hi, I have a question. I'm Fabiola from Peru. Thank you for your lecture. So I was reading the text of Andrés Lucero, and there's a part that he says about one of the interviewees. They say, how do we get creative if we are gathering images from other projects and they want to propose something new, something original? So I would like to know your opinion about this. How does originality play a role in the mood board process? Thank you.
I guess I can start again if that's okay, Sam. I don't mean to be older brother situation here. I think this really speaks to Salomon's prompt, right, about mannerism as a question, right? And so with mannerism, there's historians mostly don't use this term anymore because scholars of the 16th century have historicized it and debated it endlessly. But early on, right, since Vasari, the question of how architects and painters and sculptors are being original is the core issue here, right? Vasari laments the turn from the high Renaissance to the mannerism of the late Renaissance of the 16th century, because it's a turn away from nature, right? This idea that you can find inspiration from the world around you, and rather you're going to start finding inspiration from other artists, right? And that idea is that's a lament for him, but then it's also a kind of boon for artists, right? Because they come to consider themselves, when they make work, they come to consider themselves working within a history, right? As soon as Becca Fumi starts painting, he's like, oh yeah, well, am I like Raphael here, or how am I differing from? And so that differential between his painting and Raphael's becomes a kind of source both of concern and anxiety, but also a way of making innovations, right? And architects and painters and other artists find themselves working within a field of practice populated by other people in the profession, right? And it's key to what we're talking about today, right? And of course, art historians and other artists bemoan this, because art becomes ever more stylized as it becomes ever more premised on the work of one's peers and predecessors and rivals, right? But it also means that there's a kind of knowledge of what's happening in your field and also what's happening over history, right? So arguably Mannerism is the moment when art history and architectural history as disciplines form, right? So this question of how original you can be, right? The whole idea is I think Sam said it nicely sometime in the presentation, is they need to be original, but they can only do that by seeing where they fit in position wise in the field of practice.
Another question?
Yes. Hi, this is Nigel from Mexico. Thank you for your very interesting presentation. I would like to ask that, well, in my experience, I have presented mood boards to clients or in architectural contests. And I am very curious, while doing your research or in your experience, what is the impact of mood boards in clients? Because they may think there are just a bunch of images, but I don't know. Do you have any ideas?
Yes, we unfortunately we couldn't show or even access the mood boarding between Max and Bill and their artist client, but we did interview them about how that was working, and it seemed like there's two sides to this question. So on the one hand, the designers will sometimes talk about the mood boards as a kind of common ground between their field of expertise, the kind of specialized languages of architecture, and the lay understanding of a client. Of course, all clients are really different, but the mood board, designers like mood boards because what they say is that they like them because they become a kind of lingua franca between the design world and the client. The client can respond just like these qualitative researchers are just asking consumers to voice their preferences and to be stimulated by this collection of images. Clients also say, oh yeah, I like the way this looks, or I like the general look of this, even if they don't pick up on specific associations or references. But one thing that we found, not in studying more the speech around mood boards rather than the board itself, is that the mood boards leave a lot of room for the designers to hedge and to keep multiple possibilities in play. So their semantic ambiguity, as Lucero puts it, is actually a way of maintaining flexibility on their part. They don't need to, because the board is so vague, they're not locked into a specific decision or direction. And more that kind of flexibility, that I guess you could say freedom, is important in a context in which architects can't make fixed plans. So I think we're still thinking about the implications of this today, or what it says about working life today. But I think mood boards have this kind of paradoxical two sides. They promise this kind of immediacy and communication, but they also withhold decisions and allow for hedging.
Just to follow up on that, I had one kind of question here, or have you thought about let's say in relation to client relations, have you thought about the sort of 18th and 19th century pattern books in relation to the mood board? I mean, as a kind of, as both the kind of communicative tool to a set of ideas, or desires or consumer desires, and how maybe that led to, in let's say the 18th century, to a kind of eclecticism, from a kind of, let's say, Neo-Palladian villa to a kind of eclecticism, dare I use that word, I know it's heavy, to a eclecticism that exists today, by basically the juxtaposition of all these things. Yeah, so I guess the question is, yeah, do you see a relationship between the pattern book and how that once fulfilled desires and the mood board today?
I'll start, or should
Go for it.
I mean, I think one of the things we were really wrestling with in this presentation, and it really came out when Sam started talking about that Horta drawing, was, yeah, like, where does eclecticism, historicism, and then eventually postmodernism, right? Where does this fit into these questions, right? Is it our mood boards a form of pastiche? You know, are we just combining images together? And of course, in the 70s and 80s with postmodernism, there's the notion that there's a kind of free play of signifiers, right? And you can imagine, like, all these different images from different historical sources are coming together, and there's a bit of that happening, right, with Max and Bill, where they are trying to find a look, but they don't want to get too into the history of it, right? And they're putting it together. And so one of our hypotheses was that eclecticism kind of leads to a new form of working process, I guess you might say, right? Where, you know, in the work of someone like Venturi, who we were like, should we put Venturi in here? You know, finding all these different historical moments and putting them into a single room, say, or into a facade, right? Is that something that used to happen within the form of architecture, now is kind of migrating its way into process itself, right? And it's no longer done for kind of free play purposes or something like that, or shock value, but is rather just a kind of ordinary part of the working experience. But I'll let Sam discuss as well, because this is really more of architecture history.
Yeah, I think, well, I guess one distinction that I would draw between the use of a pattern book and the way that Bill is navigating blogs, websites, Instagram feeds, is that you know, the pattern, maybe it's just a question of standardization. Like, the pattern book presents us a standard set of patterns that many architects have access to, and can pick and choose from. And I guess you're right, as they play a role in how architects are framing their choices with clients, because clients can look through the pattern book too and choose from a set of patterns. But I think something is different happening. There's a difference between the way that Bill is recalling these qualities in images that he's seen online, and kind of navigating towards them, and then selecting them. Maybe it's just the wider, that there's a wider amount of stuff that he could choose from. Like, it's not contained within a single book, or I don't know. I mean, I guess architects, there are many instances in which architects can collect and select from libraries. So, like, Sweet's catalog is another instance of this, but I don't think we would say that the choosing of a detail, the choosing of a construction standard is quite the same thing as picking out a reference that creates a mood around the look of the space, even if details do in their materialization can affect the way that architecture will appear. So it's hard to, I mean, this goes back to Mariano's thing about, you know, does the CM grill count in this study? It's hard for us to know where to draw the line between what is sourcing for mood and what is sourcing for kind of construction, or if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes sense. Other questions? It's hard for me to see here, so don't be polite, just interject. Anna?
I guess we're wondering also if you're being assigned mood boards at the Berlage, if anyone has any insight into that.
Maybe if I may. First of all, thank you for your. Sorry, we're having a feedback loop. Thank you, Mariano. I entered the Berlage program in 2020, September of 2020. So that was, I think, a half year into the COVID pandemic, and that kind of accelerated this need for finding these online collaborative platforms, such as Miro. I guess like the rest of the world, we were trying to figure it out how to use it in a collaborative and productive setting ourselves. And I found it interesting to see that Max and Bill, they're using this online collaborative environment, whereas they have also access to each other in this physical realm, right? Flipping through books and not being restricted to this online realm of, I don't know, Google image searches, Instagram. And one platform which curiously I didn't come up, I think, during your talk, which is Pinterest, which is a whole ecosystem in itself. Also, maybe especially also for clients who well, are also aware of that space. And maybe this is something outside of the scope of your research, but I was curious if you could, yeah, if you have any reflections or comments on that. Pinterest as a, let's say, enclosed, self-contained almost ecosystem of, yeah, our library.
Yeah, there's another point in the footage that we didn't show in which Bill goes on Pinterest and Max looks over and he says, oh, he groans and he says, Pinterest, the worst, the worst. And we might think, well, what's the difference, right, between sourcing from Pinterest and sourcing from the zine, or, you know, knowing about this Rashid Johnson sculpture in the Instagram feed. But I think and maybe there is no meaningful difference for us, but for Bill and Max, there seems to be a kind of hierarchy between different search engines, like different collections, which are either accessible or more specialized. So there's something about Pinterest and its wide use. Maybe it's more ordinary use by people who just pin the things that they like and make their own private collections of images online, and the kind of extra special images that they are putting together for this artist client. So I thought that was a telling moment that they, and all these images are possibly, all these images could go into their mood board, but they want to make sure that they come from a kind of more rarefied realm of images, or yeah, was that your impression too, Jacob?
Yeah, I would, I guess there's like two things here. One of them has to do with like what we would call like algorithm studies, right? And this new field that's coming to the fore in the past, you know, half decade, about how algorithms work, you know, how they source and how they sieve information. You know, we're really wondering, like, when we began this project, are Max and Bill and other designers, or we, right, as you know, or you working, you know, as future or present architects, right? What is the job of the architect just becoming this kind of like end tastemaker, right? Who's like got all of the different search engines and governed by algorithms, and then they're able to at the very last minute find the right combination for the client, right? And if that's so, is that kind of yucky? Is that like not really what we want to be doing as architects or as designers? And then we've also noticed, as algorithm studies has come to the fore, like we don't want to just be seen as human prostheses of these search engines, right? It's kind of like this last, human sieve at the end of this long-standing kind of artificial process or something, right? But at the same time, is this kind of new worry about this kind of white collar labor, right, which is not just performed by architects by any means, but by many different professions who have to deal with sieving images. Like, is this, it seems like at the same time there's been this huge surge in software that's entered into this digital space of creating new platforms for doing this very work. So I think not just of Pinterest or Miro, but like our Arena, right, which is specifically for us, right, as creatives or whatever, right, who are supposed to like create these blocks of images that are topic specific, and that might be like, as Sam's pointing out, there's kind of ecology among who's using these different social media sites. So yeah, it's all very complicated, and I think in the introduction to our book, we'll have to address that pretty directly. We've tried to make inroads with trying to get people on InVision or Dribble or these sites, these kind of new sites that are geared towards remote mood boarding, to kind of give us some insight into how this software is developed, because it might be interesting to know like what kind of conversations the software developers are having about how conversation and image sharing work as they devise their programs. But we haven't had that much luck yet. There's quite a bit of preliminary conversations that you need to have to get into those spaces. So
great, awesome. Thank you for your comments.
Great, thanks. Christy, you had one last question.
Yes, hi, thank you for your lecture. In my experience, I have been always using mood boards as a collection of reference for projects. And seeing the footage about their working, for me, it was very related to what I'm used to work when working in a project, a professional project, I mean. But at the same time, for me, it is, when I was also reading the Lucero's text, for me, the concept he's explaining is more related to exactly the idea of producing the mood, but very abstract photos and images that actually creates the concept of the project, and he wants to run away from the concrete and practical ideas. And he argues that this is that using concrete ideas guides to very detailed discussions, and that's not actually the point. So my question is like, how do you see that? There is a gray in between. There's both mood boards is the same. You think it's separated? What's your position on that?
I can begin, but I think you're absolutely right that there was a kind of sleight of hand in our talk, right? Which you might say, right, where there's two kinds of mood boards. There's the kind discussed by Lucero, right, which is about, semantic ambiguity and not getting too precise, right, as you're saying, right, providing inspiration at the beginning of a project, perhaps. But then mood boards change over various iterations, and so the kind of in mood boards that circulate on the intranet of companies, right, like Max, Bill, and their coworkers, they're using mood boards in a different way, right, to be more specific, to get slowly more clarification about what it is they're going to do with a project as it comes to fruition. So I do think that there's a real difference between client firm mood boards at the beginning of a project and then intra-firm mood boards as they make their way through to a project realization. Because who wants to see like dolphins and et cetera at the very end of your project? You're like, what are we actually making here, right? So
who doesn't want to see dolphins at the end of the project? Yeah, I think that what Max and Bill are doing is much more directly related to a longer history of interior design. Mood boarding, this is something that one of the contributor writing about these design books at the Maritime Museum, and how clients and designers would source from swatches and textures, is maybe a predecessor to what Max and Bill are doing in Miro. But at the same time, they also use mood boarding at other phases in the project, as Jacob's saying, as a way of coming up with more conceptual ideas about the project at the outset. Or I think even at the very end, they can come in when, if they reach an impasse with the client and they need to sort of go back to a more loose or flexible way of communicating with them. So I don't know. I mean, one of the arguments that or the hypothesis that we're thinking about in terms of architecture is architecture moving, as architects become more concerned with the look of their work in this sphere of competition in which looks have never been more important, and people are going to register these minor distinctions on websites like Dezeen and Instagram and Pinterest. Is mood boarding changing within practice from this earlier mode of sampling and using textures and the kind of interior design version of mood board towards mood boards as they're used to innovate products today, which are more about semantic ambiguity, the kind of mood boards that Lucero talks about. And what would be the implication of that shift for architects in terms of their work and their creativity? But it's an ongoing question, one that we're trying to resolve, not just through research and observation, but also through drawing on the expertise of people who study mood boards in all these different contexts. So.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sam and Jacob.
Thank you.
Thank you, yeah.
So a round of applause, at least you can hear something to get the energy back before you get some